Folek's hands trembled as she stared at the pregnancy test, watching the second line darken with cruel certainty. Her daughter Eniola lay sleeping in the next room, her beautiful, innocent Eniola who couldn't speak, couldn't defend herself, couldn't even understand what had been done to her. Jesus Christ, Folek whispered, sinking to the bathroom floor. The tiles felt cold against her legs, but not as cold as the dread spreading through her chest. Eniola was 19, severely intellectually disabled since birth, with the cognitive capacity of a 6-year-old child. She couldn't dress herself without help. She couldn't prepare her own meals. She certainly couldn't consent to anything. Someone had violated her daughter. Folek had noticed the changes 3 weeks ago, Eniola's usual cheerfulness replaced by withdrawn silence, the way she flinched when touched, how she cried during her baths. When Eniola's period didn't come, Folek had dismissed it as stress. But when the second month passed, maternal instinct overrode denial. She heard her husband Adebayo's car pull into the driveway of their Lagos home. He'd been distant lately, working longer hours at his accounting firm, coming home exhausted and irritable. Their marriage had grown cold over the past year, separate bedrooms, perfunctory conversations, a politeness that barely masked resentment. Folek. Adebayo called from downstairs. I'm home. She couldn't answer. Her throat had closed around words too terrible to speak. Instead, she clutched the positive test and tried to breathe through the panic clawing at her lungs. Adebayo appeared in the bathroom doorway, loosening his tie. He was 46, still handsome despite the grey thread in his hair, but there was something in his eyes lately, a guardedness she couldn't quite identify. What's wrong? He asked, then saw the test in her hand. His face went completely blank. Eniola is pregnant, Folek said, each word scraping her throat raw. Our daughter. Our disabled daughter who can't even speak. Someone raped her, Adebayo. Someone came into our home and... Don't jump to conclusions, he interrupted, his voice too controlled. Maybe there's another explanation. Folek stared at him. Another explanation. She has the mind of a child. She can't consent. She can't even understand what sex is. Her voice rose to a scream. Who did this to her? Adebayo stepped backward, and something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like guilt. We'll figure it out. We'll take her to the doctor, run test. Test. Folek stood, rage replacing shock. My daughter was raped in her own home, and you want to run test. We need to call the police. We need to find out who. She stopped, studying her husband's face. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Adebayo, look at me. He turned away. I need water. We'll discuss this after I've had time to think. Time to think. She grabbed his arm, spinning him around. What is there to think about? Unless. The implication hovered between them like poison gas. Unless you know something you're not telling me. Don't be ridiculous. But his voice cracked on the last syllable. Folek's word tilted. 22 years of marriage, and suddenly she was looking at a stranger. Where were you last Tuesday evening when I took my mother to the hospital? Working late. I told you that. And the Thursday before, when I went to the market. Folek, stop this. His jaw clenched. You're being paranoid. Then why won't you look at me? She moved closer, searching his face for the man she'd married, the man who'd cried when Eniola was born, who'd held their damaged daughter and promised to protect her always. Adebayo, please. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you have nothing to do with this. He pulled away from her grasp, his face hardening into a mask she didn't recognize. I'm going to my study. We'll talk when you're calmer. But Folek wasn't calm. She was drowning in suspicion that tasted like battery acid. As Adebayo's footsteps retreated down the hallway, she thought of all the small things she'd dismissed: his insistence on bathing Eniola himself when Folake was busy, the way he'd installed a lock on his study door, his sudden interest in staying home when Folake had errands to run. The house suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward, trapping secrets that would suffocate them all. From Eniola's room came a soft whimper, her daughter having another nightmare. Folake went to her, smoothing damp curls from Eniola's forehead, and saw fresh finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms. And in that moment, Folake knew. She just didn't want to believe it yet. Morning came without sleep. Folake sat in the kitchen, watching Dawn paint the Lego skyline gold and crimson, colors too beautiful for the ugliness unfolding in her home. Adebayo had left early for work without saying goodbye, or perhaps without daring to face her. Eniola shuffled into the kitchen in her nightgown, her lovely face puffy from crying in her sleep. She'd inherited Folake's high cheekbones and full lips, Adebayo's large, expressive eyes. Those eyes now held a confusion that broke Folake's heart. "Mama," Eniola said, one of the few words she could speak clearly. She touched her stomach with both hands, a gesture that sent ice through Folake's veins. "Hearts. I know, baby. I know." Folake pulled her daughter close, breathing in her familiar scent of cocoa butter and innocence. "We are going to the doctor today, okay? Dr. Okonkwo will make it better." But even as she spoke the reassurance, Folake knew nothing would make this better. Some violations couldn't be healed, only survived. After settling Eniola with breakfast, Folake stood outside Adebayo's study. He'd locked it before leaving, he always locked it now. She retrieved the spare key from the junk drawer, her hand steady despite the nausea churning her stomach. The study smelled of leather and old spice, masculine and familiar. Adebayo's computer sat on the mahogany desk, its screen dark and waiting. Folake had never invaded his privacy before, had trusted him absolutely for 22 years. That trust was now a rotting corpse between them. She pressed the power button. The computer hummed to life, prompting for a password. Folake tried their anniversary, denied. Eniola's birthday, denied. Then, with trembling fingers, she typed his mother's name, Famileo. The desktop appeared. Folake's breath came in short gasps as she opened his documents folder. At first, nothing seemed unusual: work files, tax records, household receipts. Then she noticed a folder labeled Private buried within another folder labeled Backup Files 2023. She clicked it open. The first image made her retch. Photos. Videos. Dozens of them. All of Eniola. Her innocent daughter in positions no daughter should ever be in, especially not with. Folake vomited into the waste paper basket, her body rejecting reality itself. But when she looked back at the screen, the images remained, each one a fresh knife wound to her soul. The dates stretched back 6 months. 6 months of systematic abuse. The videos were worse, she could only watch seconds before grief and rage overwhelmed her. Adebayo's voice, tender and manipulative: "That's my good girl, Eniola. Daddy loves you. This is our special secret. Their special secret." Folake's scream tore from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond language. She grabbed the monitor and threw it against the wall, watched it shatter into 1,000 pieces, like her marriage, like her trust, like her daughter's innocence. Eniola appeared in the doorway, frightened by the noise. "Mama." Folake looked at her daughter, really looked, and saw all the signs she'd been too blind to notice. The way Eniola had started avoiding Adebayo 3 months ago. The regression in her limited speech. The bedwetting that had returned after years. The nightmares. How had she missed it? How had she failed so completely? "It's okay, baby," Folake lied, pulling Eniola into her arms. "Everything's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay again. Her phone buzzed, a text from Adebayo: don't do anything rash. We need to talk. There are things you don't understand. Folek stared at the message, at the audacity of those words. Things she didn't understand. She understood that her husband was a monster. She understood that he'd spent 6 months raping their disabled daughter. She understood that the pregnancy growing in Eniola's womb carried her husband's DNA. Her fingers moved almost automatically, dialing the police. Emergency services, how can I help you? My husband raped my daughter, Folek said, her voice eerily calm now, shock converting horror into cold precision. I have video evidence. I need officers sent to my home immediately, and I need him arrested at his workplace before he runs. Mom, please stay on the line. I'm dispatching officers now. Can you confirm your address? As Folek recited her information, she watched Eniola playing with her doll, the same doll she'd had since childhood, its young hair matted from years of love. Eniola hummed tunelessly, lost in her simple world, unaware that her mother's heart was shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The police arrived within 30 minutes, 2 officers, a man and a woman, their expressions carefully neutral as Folek showed them the computer evidence. The female officer, Detective Kaameka, had kind eyes that filled with tears as she documented the files. Mrs. Ogonlai, she said gently, I need to ask, has Eniola received a medical examination yet? We have an appointment this afternoon. We'll need to expedite that. We'll send a forensic team to collect evidence, and we'll need to document. She glanced at Eniola, who was watching them with worried eyes. Everything. The world became a blur of procedures, statements, photographs, evidence collection. Somewhere across Lagos, other officers were arresting Adebayo at his farm, handcuffing him in front of his colleagues, ending the respectable life he'd built on his daughter's suffering. Folek's phone rang constantly, Adebayo's mother Famileo, his siblings, their neighbors, all demanding to know what was happening, all certain there must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Only truth, finally dragged into the light. The police station smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Folek sat in a cramped interrogation room with Detective Kaameka, watching through one-way glass as Adebayo was processed. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his expensive suit and confident bearing. When they took his fingerprints, his hands shook. Good. Let him shake. Let him feel a fraction of the fear Eniola must have felt. Mrs. Ogonlai, Detective Kaameka said softly, I need you to understand the process ahead. The computer evidence is compelling, but we'll need medical evidence too. The examination this afternoon will be difficult for you and for Eniola. Folek nodded, numb. Will she have to testify? Given her cognitive disability, probably not in the traditional sense. But we'll need experts to assess whether she can communicate what happened in any way. The detective paused. The pregnancy itself is evidence. DNA testing will confirm. It's his. Folek's voice was flat. I know it's his. The dates match. And Eniola never leaves the house without me except. She swallowed hard. Except when he insisted on staying home with her. When he said I needed time to myself, that he'd take care of our daughter. Take care of her. The phrase curdled in Folek's mouth. Through the glass, detectives led Adebayo to an interrogation room. He'd asked for a lawyer, but his initial statements had already been recorded. Folek had heard the audio, his voice calm and measured, claiming misunderstanding, manipulation of evidence, his wife's mental instability. He was still lying. Even caught, even with his crimes documented in pixels and DNA, he was still lying. Funmileo, Adebayo's mother, arrived at the station like a hurricane in traditional wrapper and head tie. She was 70, formidable, and absolutely convinced of her son's innocence. This is madness. Funmileo shouted at Folek in the waiting area. My Adebayo would never, he's a good man, a God-fearing man. You've poisoned the police against him with your lies. I have video evidence, Folek said quietly. Your son raped Eniola. Your granddaughter. Multiple times. He recorded it. Fonmeleo's hand cracked across Folek's face. Liar. You're trying to destroy him because you're a bitter, barren woman who only gave him one damaged child. Security officers intervened, pulling Fonmeleo back as she continued screaming accusations. Detective Kayameka led Folek to a private room, pressing ice to her swelling cheek. That woman just assaulted you, the detective said. Do you want to press charges? Folek shook her head. What was one slap compared to what Adebayo had done? Besides, Fonmeleo was defending her son, the same instinct that was now driving Folek to destroy him. They were two mothers on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm. The medical examination was worse than Folek imagined. Eniola didn't understand why strangers were touching her, why the doctors were examining her private areas, why they were taking swabs and photographs. She cried for her mother, but Folek wasn't allowed in the room to preserve evidence integrity, they said. So Folek stood in the hallway, listening to her daughter's confused sobs, and felt her soul fragment into pieces. Dr. Okonkwo emerged after an hour, her face grave. Mrs. Ogunlai, I need to explain Eniola's options regarding the pregnancy. Options. Folek's laugh was bitter. She's 11 weeks along. In Nigeria, termination is only legal to save the mother's life. Which is why we need to document that continuing this pregnancy poses severe psychological trauma that could be life-threatening, Dr. Okonkwo said firmly. Eniola can't understand what's happening to her body. She can't consent to pregnancy any more than she could consent to sex. Forcing her to carry her father's child would constitute continued abuse. The word father, applied to both Adebayo's relationship to Eniola and to the fetus inside her, made Folek's gorge rise again. But the law has provisions for circumstances like this, Dr. Okonkwo interrupted. We'll need psychiatric evaluations, a medical board review, but I believe we can make the case. However, you need to decide quickly. The further along she gets, the more complicated everything becomes. Folek thought of Eniola, her sweet baby who loved Peppa Pig and butterflies and mango slices. Could she force her daughter to carry this pregnancy? To birth a child that was both sibling and child, conceived in violence and betrayal. But termination meant procedures Eniola wouldn't understand, more trauma, more violation of her body by strangers. There were no good choices. Only terrible ones. I need to think, Folek whispered. You have 48 hours before it becomes exponentially more difficult medically and legally. Dr. Okonkwo squeezed her shoulder. I'm sorry. No mother should have to make this decision. That evening, back home, Folek sat with Eniola in her bedroom. Her daughter was drawing stick figures of their family, the same picture she'd drawn 1,000 times. Mama, Papa, Eniola. A triangle of love that had concealed wrath at its center. Eniola drew a line through the Papa figure, then another, until he was scribbled out completely. Gone, Eniola said, touching the paper. Bad. Folek's tears finally came, hot and unstoppable. Yes, baby. Bad. Papa is gone. Eniola patted her mother's hand with clumsy tenderness. Mama sad. Mama sad, Folek agreed. But Mama loves you. Always, always loves you. That night, Folek made her decision. She couldn't force Eniola through pregnancy, couldn't make her daughter carry physical evidence of a violation for 9 months. It was wrong in ways that defied easy moral categorization, but forcing the pregnancy would be worse. She called Dr. Okonkwo and began the process that would end one violation but require another. There were no good choices. Only survival. 3 months later, Lagos was sweltering in harmattan heat as Adebayo's trial began. He'd been denied bail, the evidence too overwhelming, flight risk too high. Folake had hired the best prosecutor available, using money from their joint account before Adebayo's lawyer could freeze it. The courtroom was packed. Media coverage had been extensive. Respected accountant accused of raping disabled daughter had dominated headlines for weeks. Their church had split, half supporting Folake, half certain she'd manufactured evidence in a bitter divorce scheme. Funmilayo sat in the front row behind Adebayo, glaring daggers at Folake. She'd mortgaged her house to pay for Adebayo's defense, convinced her son was being railroaded by a vindictive wife and overzealous police. Folake sat on the opposite side with her sister Bimp, who'd flown in from Abuja to provide support. Eniola was not in court. The judge had ruled her presence unnecessary given her inability to testify coherently. The termination had been completed 6 weeks ago. Eniola had been confused and frightened, but the procedure was quick. Afterward, she'd asked where the big tummy went, and Folake had told her it was sick and the doctors made it better. Eniola had accepted this with the trust of a child who believes her mother can fix anything. If only that were true. Adebayo's lawyer, Barrister Okafor, was a shark in designer suits. His opening statement painted Adebayo as a devoted father wrongly accused by a jealous wife experiencing emptiness syndrome and possible psychological breaks. Members of the jury, Okafor said, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity, this is a case of tragic misunderstanding. Mr. Ogunlai bathed his disabled daughter as part of his caretaking duties, something he'd done since childhood. The so-called videos show nothing more than a father helping his daughter with personal hygiene. Mrs. Ogunlai, unable to accept that her husband might leave her for another woman, has twisted innocent care into something sinister. It was obscene. Folake had watched those videos. There was no innocent care in what Adebayo had done. But Okafor was skilled, planting seeds of doubt with careful phrasing. The prosecution called Dr. Okonkwo first. She testified about Eniola's injuries, evidence of repeated sexual trauma, vaginal tearing consistent with assault, psychological damage manifesting in behavioral regression. Doctor, the prosecutor asked, in your medical opinion, could these injuries have been sustained accidentally during hygiene care? Absolutely not, Dr. Okonkwo said firmly. The pattern of injury, the psychological trauma, the pregnancy, these are consistent with repeated sexual abuse, not caretaking. Barrister Okafor's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Dr. Okonkwo's methodology, her potential bias, her interpretation of evidence. He suggested Eniola might have been abused by someone else, a delivery man, a neighbor, anyone but Adebayo. Doctor, you can't actually prove Mr. Ogunlai caused these injuries, can you? Okafor pressed. Only that injuries exist. The DNA evidence. DNA proves paternity of the terminated fetus. It doesn't prove when or how conception occurred. It went on like this for days. Expert witnesses presented computer forensics. The videos were authentic, unmanipulated, recorded on Adebayo's personal devices. The defense claimed hackers, deepfakes, technological manipulation by vengeful wives with money and motivation. When Folake testified, Barrister Okafor tried to paint her as unstable, controlling, possibly abusive herself. He pointed out that she'd been the primary caretaker. Didn't that give her more opportunity for abuse? Mrs. Ogunlai, Okafor said smoothly, isn't it true that you resented your daughter's disability? That you'd expressed frustration about caring for her? Every parent of a disabled child has moments of frustration, Folake said through gritted teeth. That doesn't mean I'd harm her. But you did terminate her pregnancy without consulting your husband. Doesn't that show a pattern of making unilateral decisions about Eniola's body? I terminated a pregnancy resulting from rape. Folake's voice cracked. I protected my daughter from further trauma. Or you destroyed evidence that might have exonerated your husband. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Folake wanted to scream that DNA evidence had been preserved, that medical records documented everything, but the damage was done. Okafor had planted his poison. The trial dragged through June and into July. Character witnesses testified on both sides, Adebayo's colleagues describing a dedicated family man, Foleke's friends describing her devotion to Eniola. The videos were played in closed court, sparing the public but forcing the jury to watch every horrifying second. 3 jurors cried. 1 requested replacement due to emotional distress. The judge denied it. This is difficult, she told the jury, but justice requires witnessing difficult truths. Finally, closing arguments. The prosecution laid out the evidence systematically: videos, DNA, medical testimony, computer forensics. It was overwhelming, damning, incontrovertible. Barrister Okafor stood and spoke for 90 minutes about reasonable doubt, false accusations, the tragedy of families destroyed by misunderstanding. He was eloquent, passionate, almost convincing. Almost. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Foleke didn't sleep, didn't eat, existed in suspended animation between hope and despair. If Adebayo was acquitted, what would that mean? That he'd be free to hurt someone else. That Eniola's suffering meant nothing. On the 3rd day, the jury returned. On the charge of rape of a dependent person, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of incest, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of child sexual abuse, how do you find? Guilty. Foleke collapsed in her chair, sobbing. Behind her, Famileo wailed like a dying animal. Adebayo stood motionless as they read each verdict, his face grey as ash. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. Maximum penalties, 25 years imprisonment. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed. Foleke said nothing, letting her lawyer handle statements. But one reporter's question cut through the chaos: "Mrs. Ogunleye, do you forgive your husband?" Foleke stopped, turned, looked directly at the camera. "No," she said. "I will never forgive him. Forgiveness is for mistakes and accidents. What he did was deliberate evil. He destroyed our daughter's innocence, betrayed every trust, violated every sacred bond. The guilty verdict doesn't fix what's broken, but it tells Eniola, and every voiceless victim, that they matter. That's not forgiveness. That's justice." The clip went viral. Some praised her strength. Others condemned her hardness, said Christians must forgive. Foleke ignored them all. She'd learned that some cracks never heal. You just build your life around them. Sentencing day arrived like a funeral. The courtroom was quieter now. The media circus had moved on to fresher scandals, though a few cameras remained to document the end. Adebayo had lost weight in prison. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, and his eyes held a hollowness that might have been regret or might have been self-pity. Foleke couldn't tell and didn't care. The judge was a woman in her 60s, Justice Adeyemi, known for her firm stance on crimes against children. She'd presided over the trial with visible anger barely restrained by judicial protocol. "Mr. Ogunleye," Justice Adeyemi began, her voice cold and precise, "I have reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the jury's verdict. I have also read your pre-sentencing statement, in which you claim to love your daughter and insist this was all a misunderstanding." Adebayo stood, his lawyer beside him. "Let me be clear," the judge continued. "What you did to Eniola was not love. Love protects. Love cherishes. Love would die before causing harm. You are a predator who used your position as a father, the one person she should have been able to trust absolutely, to violate her repeatedly. You documented your crimes as trophies. You showed no remorse until facing consequences." Fonmeleo sobbed loudly. The judge ignored her. The law allows for sentences up to 25 years for crimes of this nature. Given the severity, the duration of abuse, the victim's vulnerability, and your complete lack of genuine remorse, I am sentencing you to the maximum, 25 years imprisonment without possibility of parole for 15 years. Adebayo's knees buckled. His lawyer caught him. Additionally, Justice Adeyemi said, I am issuing a permanent restraining order. You will have no contact with Eniola or Mrs. Ogunleye for the duration of your natural life. Should you attempt contact through any means, additional charges will be filed. Do you understand? Your Honor, Adebayo said, his voice breaking, please, I need to explain. There is nothing to explain that hasn't been explained already through evidence. You will serve your sentence at Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison. She banged her gavel. Court dismissed. As guards led Adebayo away, he turned to look at Folake. Their eyes met across the courtroom. 22 years of marriage, a lifetime of trust, all reduced to this moment of unbridgeable division. I'm sorry, he mouthed. Folake turned away. His apology meant nothing. Words couldn't unmake his choices or heal their daughter. Outside, the Lagos sun was merciless. Folake climbed into her sister's car, feeling ancient despite being only 43. It's done, Bim said quietly. You can move forward now. But moving forward required a destination, and Folake couldn't see one. Their home was contaminated by memory. Their bank accounts were depleted by legal fees. Their community was divided between supporters and skeptics. Even victory felt like defeat. At home, Eniola was playing in the garden with a new caregiver, a kind woman named Patience who'd been thoroughly vetted and never left alone with Eniola. When she saw Folake, Eniola ran over, her face bright. Mama! Look! She held up a butterfly that had landed on her hand, its wings iridescent in the afternoon light. Beautiful, baby, Folake managed, pulling her daughter close. Papa? Eniola asked, as she did sometimes, her damaged memory unable to fully retain why he was gone. Papa's gone, Folake said, the same answer she always gave. Papa did bad things, so he went away. Good, Eniola said firmly, then returned to her butterfly. In the weeks that followed, Folake began the slow process of rebuilding. She sold their house, too many bad memories, and bought a smaller one across town. She started therapy for both herself and Eniola. She returned to her abandoned career in teaching, finding purpose in shaping young minds. Eniola slowly improved. The nightmares decreased. Her speech expanded slightly. She still asked for a papa occasionally, but the question held less confusion each time. 6 months after sentencing, Folake received a letter from Adebayo's prison. She almost threw it away unopened, but morbid curiosity won. The letter was long, rambling, full of self-justification disguised as apology. He claimed addiction, trauma from his own childhood, mental illness, anything to shift blame from himself. He begged for visitation rights, insisted Eniola needed her father. Folake burned the letter in the kitchen sink, watching his words curl into ash. Eniola needed many things: stability, safety, love, proper medical care, a future free from exploitation. She did not need Adebayo. 1 year after the trial, Folake was featured in a documentary about incest survivors. She spoke carefully, protecting Eniola's privacy while advocating for disabled victims who couldn't advocate for themselves. People ask if I regret not seeing the signs earlier, Folake told the camera. Of course I do. I regret every moment I trusted him, every time I left them alone, every sign I missed. But regret doesn't change the past. What changes the future is speaking truth, demanding justice, and protecting the vulnerable even when, especially when, the predator is someone we love. The documentary sparked national conversation. Laws were strengthened around disabled victims' rights. Support groups formed. Other families came forward with similar stories, emboldened by Folake's refusal to be silenced by shame. But late at night, when Eniola was asleep and the house was quiet, Folake still cried. She cried for the marriage she thought she had, the man she thought she loved, the family that had been destroyed by one person's evil choices. Some losses couldn't be reconciled, only survived. On what would have been their 25th wedding anniversary, Folake took Eniola to the beach. They built sandcastles and collected shells, and Eniola laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in 18 months. Happy, Mama? Eniola asked, holding a perfect conch shell. Folek looked at her daughter, damaged but resilient, innocent despite everything, still capable of joy, and felt something shift in her chest. Not happiness exactly. Not healing. But perhaps the beginning of acceptance. Yes, baby, she said. Mama's happy. It was a lie, but it was also true. She was happy Eniola was safe, happy justice had been served, happy they'd survived. The other happiness, the simple joy of an intact family, the trust in another person, the belief in happily ever after, was gone forever. But they were alive. They were together. They had survived. Sometimes, in a world full of predators and broken trust, survival was its own kind of victory. Adebayo served his sentence in full, dying in prison at 71 of untreated illness, a final consequence of his choices. Funmilayo never spoke to Folek again, dying believing her son was wrongly convicted, her denial protecting her from unbearable truth. Eniola lived to 53, cared for by her mother until Folek's death, then by loving caretakers in a specialized home. She never fully understood what had happened to her, a mercy and a tragedy in equal measure. Folek never remarried, never fully trusted again. But she built a life of purpose from ruins, advocating, teaching, protecting others from the predators who hide behind respectability and familiar love. The guilty verdict didn't heal their wounds. Justice didn't restore innocence or repair broken trust. But it sent a message to every victim and every predator: actions have consequences that cannot be undone, and evil, even when clothed in Father's love, will eventually face its reckoning. Some sins are beyond forgiveness. But they are never beyond justice.